Welcome back to Days of Our Lives channel. Today we delve into the most shocking and devastating storyline that has left Salem residents reeling and fans worldwide in absolute disbelief. The tragic Halloween night that forever changed the landscape of our beloved soap opera has arrived, and the consequences are more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Alex Kyriakis' brutal stabbing death at the hands of Jeremy Horton during what was supposed to be a celebratory Halloween party has sent shockwaves through Salem, leaving viewers questioning how such a beloved character could meet such a violent end. The meticulously planned Halloween festivities that were meant to bring joy and community spirit to Salem instead became the backdrop for one of the most heinous crimes in the show's history. What started as an elegant costume party filled with laughter, champagne toasts, and the promise of new beginnings quickly devolved into a nightmare of blood, screams, and unimaginable loss that will haunt Salem's residents for years to come. The Fatal Connection, Stephanie's book and Jeremy's deadly return. The opening of the Horton Free Clinic in November served as the perfect cover for Jeremy Horton's sinister return to Salem, but nobody anticipated the deadly obsession that would consume him. Jeremy's discovery of Stephanie's best-selling romance novel one stormy night at Julie Williams' bookstore in Horton Town Square became the catalyst for the most tragic chain of events Salem has witnessed in decades. The book, published under Stephanie's pen name Anastasia Sands, contained intimate and deeply personal details that Jeremy immediately recognized from their tumultuous past relationship. What made this discovery particularly dangerous was Jeremy's deteriorating mental state and history of abusive behavior towards Stephanie during their previous relationship. The novel's autobiographical elements, which Stephanie had desperately tried to keep hidden by using a pseudonym, became like breadcrumbs leading Jeremy directly back into her life. The passages describing their volatile relationship, the emotional manipulation, and the physical altercations were all there in black and white, triggering something dark and possessive within Jeremy that had been dormant for years. Stephanie's worst fears materialized when Jeremy began stalking her around Salem, convinced that her decision to include their story in the novel meant she still harbored feelings for him. His twisted interpretation of her creative work as some form of romantic invitation would ultimately lead to the most devastating Halloween night in Salem's history. The Halloween party, from celebration to catastrophe. The Halloween costume party was meant to be Salem's most spectacular social event of the year, celebrating both the success of Stephanie's novel and the upcoming opening of the Horton Free Clinic. The venue was decorated with elaborate Halloween themes, featuring jack-o', lanterns, cobwebs, and atmospheric lighting that created the perfect ambience for what should have been a night of harmless frights and community bonding. Alex Kyriakis arrived in a dashing vampire costume, his cape flowing dramatically as he made his entrance, completely unaware that real danger lurked among the partygoers. Jeremy Horton had infiltrated the party wearing a grotesque mask that concealed his identity, allowing him to move through the crowd undetected while he stalked his targets. The sinister atmosphere of Halloween provided the perfect camouflage for his murderous intentions, as screams of delight from party games masked the very real terror that was about to unfold. Kate Roberts, Chad DeMera, and other prominent Salem residents mingled throughout the evening, completely oblivious to the fact that a predator was hunting among them. The tragic irony of the situation became apparent when Alex, in his attempts to protect Stephanie from her increasingly erratic ex-boyfriend, positioned himself directly in Jeremy's line of fire. The confrontation escalated rapidly when Jeremy cornered Stephanie in a secluded area of the party venue, demanding explanations about the book and declaring his intention to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. The brutal attack, Alex's heroic final stand. The moment Alex discovered Jeremy threatening Stephanie marked the beginning of the most harrowing sequence in Days of Our Lives history. Without hesitation, Alex threw himself between Stephanie and her deranged ex-boyfriend, demonstrating the selfless love that had defined their relationship throughout their time together. Jeremy's rage, fueled by years of obsession and recent mental deterioration, exploded into violence as he brandished a knife that glinted menacingly under the party's dim lighting. The savage attack that followed was swift but devastating, as Jeremy's blade found its mark multiple times before anyone could intervene. Alex's vampire costume became tragically prophetic as his own blood stained the elegant fabric, creating a horrifying scene that transformed the festive Halloween decorations into a crime scene of unimaginable brutality. Salem's partygoers watched in absolute horror as their beloved Alex collapsed, his life ebbing away despite Stephanie's desperate attempts to stem the bleeding and call for help. The heroic nature of Alex's final act cannot be understated. Even as Jeremy's knife pierced his body repeatedly, Alex continued to shield Stephanie from harm. Using his last moments of consciousness to ensure her safety, his final words to Stephanie, whispered through blood-stained lips, were a declaration of love that will haunt viewers and Salem residents alike for the remainder of the series. The aftermath: Salem in shock and mourning. The immediate aftermath of Alex's murder sent Salem into a state of collective trauma that paralyzed the entire community. Emergency responders arrived to find a scene of absolute carnage, with Alex's lifeless body surrounded by hysterical partygoers and Stephanie cradled in Kate Roberts' arms, covered in her boyfriend's blood and unable to comprehend the magnitude of her loss. Jeremy's capture occurred within minutes of the attack, but the damage had already been done. Salem had lost one of its most promising young men to senseless violence. The ripple effects of this tragedy began immediately, as the Kyriakis family struggled to process the loss of Alex, whose potential had seemed limitless just hours before. Victor Kyriakis' grief transformed into a burning desire for justice, while Sarah Horton found herself torn between her family loyalty and her horror at Jeremy's actions. The community's response was swift and overwhelming, with flowers, candles, and memorial tributes appearing throughout Salem as residents struggled to make sense of such a senseless act of violence. Stephanie's psychological trauma following the attack required immediate professional intervention, as she blamed herself for bringing Jeremy back into their lives through her novel. The guilt of believing her creative work had somehow caused Alex's death threatened to destroy her completely, leading to a mental health crisis that would require months of intensive therapy and support from her family and friends. The investigation and legal proceedings. The Salem Police Department's investigation into Alex's murder revealed the calculated nature of Jeremy's attack, with evidence showing he had been planning his return to Salem for weeks before the Halloween party. Detective work uncovered Jeremy's obsessive collection of articles about Stephanie's book success, along with detailed notes about her daily routines and relationship with Alex, painting a picture of a man whose mental state had deteriorated far beyond anyone's realization. The legal proceedings that followed became a media sensation, with Jeremy's defense team attempting to use his history of mental illness as mitigation for his actions. However, the premeditated nature of his attack, combined with witness testimony about his abusive past with Stephanie, made it clear that this was not a crime of passion but a calculated act of revenge and possession. The prosecution's case was strengthened by Stephanie's brave testimony about Jeremy's previous abuse, which she had never fully disclosed before, and forensic evidence that showed the methodical nature of his planning. A community forever changed. The tragedy of Alex Kyriakis' murder has fundamentally altered the fabric of Salem society, serving as a stark reminder that domestic violence and obsession can have deadly consequences even in the seemingly safe confines of their close-knit community. The Halloween celebration that was meant to bring joy instead became a cautionary tale about the dangers of hidden trauma and the importance of taking threats seriously, no matter how distant they might seem. Salem's residents now face the challenge of healing from this collective trauma while supporting Stephanie through her recovery and honoring Alex's memory in meaningful ways. The opening of the Horton Free Clinic, which Alex had been so enthusiastic about supporting, will now serve as a living memorial to his generous spirit and commitment to helping others. This devastating Halloween night will be remembered not just for the loss of a beloved character, but as the moment when Salem learned that sometimes the greatest horrors are not supernatural, but devastatingly, tragically human. Next, Days of Our Lives recap. Tuesday, September 16, 2025. Theo sets his sights on Demara while Chad reflects on loss. Welcome back, dear viewers, to another stirring and emotional day in Salem. Today's episode of Days of Our Lives delivered a blend of family tension, heartache, and quiet revelations as to familiar faces. Theo and Chad found themselves face to face once again. Though their reunion began with warmth, it quickly turned into a deep conversation about family, legacy, and the painful cost of betrayal. The story began with a surprising encounter. Theo spotted Chad sitting alone at a bar. The scene was set with that classic Salem air of nostalgia, an unexpected meeting in an ordinary place that somehow carries extraordinary weight. Theo, who has been steadily re-establishing himself in town, approached Chad with cautious optimism. Chad greeted him warmly enough, even smiling in that familiar Demara way. Yet, beneath the surface, there was hesitation. Chad seemed happy in the moment, but he dodged the one question Theo desperately wanted answered. Was he staying in Salem, or was he going to leave yet again? Theo pressed gently, but the uncertainty lingered. What truly gnawed at him was not just Chad's future, but the legacy of their powerful family. The Demaras had lost their company, an empire built with ambition, cunning, and no shortage of scandal. Theo could not understand how Chad, once the fighter and the visionary of the clan, could simply stand by without taking action. Why hadn't Chad fought harder to reclaim what was theirs? Why was he so ready to let it go? Chad, however, had reached his breaking point. He confessed he was exhausted by the endless bickering that seemed to plague the Demara family at every turn. For years, it had been one battle after another, siblings, cousins, uncles clawing at each other for power. What once felt like a duty had become nothing more than a burden. This attitude deeply frustrated Theo, who reminded Chad of the sacrifices he himself had made, including walking away from his inheritance. To Theo, the family's name and legacy should matter more than anything. But then came an important revelation. Chad calmly pointed out that Theo had never truly cared about inheritance or fortune before. For years, Theo seemed indifferent to the battles over money and power. So why now? Why was he suddenly so determined to dive into this messy war for control? Theo's silence spoke volumes, and finally, he admitted that Uncle Tony had already begun to make moves to reclaim the company. This revelation didn't surprise Chad, but it did confirm what he had long suspected. The battle for Demara was far from over, and Theo was clearly setting himself up to be a key player in the fight. The tension thickened when Theo frowned down at his phone during the conversation. Something about the way he scrolled and scowled suggested there were more secrets being kept, perhaps texts from Tony or updates on the looming takeover battle. Chad, ever observant, watched him carefully across the table, silently weighing whether Theo was being entirely truthful. Even if Demara Enterprises were reclaimed, Chad insisted, he wanted no part of it. His conviction was strong. The company needed someone young, someone with fresh ideas and an untarnished perspective, not the same old rotation of Demaras taking turns at the helm. His words carried weight, especially when he added that Tony, of all people, would likely support Theo as the future leader. For Chad, the path forward was clear. Step aside and let a new generation take control. Trying to soften the heavy mood, Theo shifted the conversation toward family, asking about the children. Chad, visibly brightened for a moment, reached for his phone to share a photo of his little ones. But as he did, he noticed something troubling. A notification, perhaps from Tony, that seemed to suggest Theo's name was being used in ways that hinted at betrayal or at the very least, hidden plans. Chad hesitated, glanced at Theo, and then, in a moment of restraint, decided to ignore it. He closed the subject and went back to talking about the kids, determined not to let family politics overshadow everything. The two men reflected on their shared losses, and this part of the conversation was perhaps the most poignant of all. They spoke of Abigail, Chad's beloved wife, whose death had left a permanent scar on his heart. Theo remembered Lexi, his mother, who had left the world too soon, taking with her a light that had once shone brightly in the Demara family. And then there was Doug, another beloved family figure whose passing reminded them of how fragile life truly was. Each name carried not only grief but also a reminder of the love and connections that once bound them all together. The somber mood eventually gave way to a different subject, romance. Chad, however, seemed almost guarded, refusing to even mention Kat, the woman who had recently entered his life. It was as if acknowledging her might betray the memory of Abigail or open old wounds he wasn't ready to face. Meanwhile, Theo revealed his own struggles. He was still heartbroken over Claire's betrayal, the affair that had shattered his trust and left him questioning his own worth. His pain was raw, his heartbreak visible in every word. Two men, cousins bound by blood and burdened by history, sat across from one another, each carrying grief, doubt, and lingering hope. For Chad, the future seemed uncertain, his role in Salem undecided, but his heart remained with his children and the memory of Abigail. For Theo, the road ahead pointed toward ambition, toward Demara, toward reclaiming a family legacy that seemed to haunt him more with each passing day. And so, the episode closed not with resolution, but with a lingering question. Will Theo rise to the challenge and seize the Demara Empire? Or will his ambition destroy the fragile bond he shares with Chad? One thing is certain, Salem's most famous family is far from finished with drama.